I will now call to order a Town of St. Andrews special meeting of council on Monday, June 15th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Recording of attendance, I note that all members of council are in attendance with the exception of Councilor Harrison is also in attendance, and it is my understanding that Councilor Gumichaud will be joining us in progress. It's been a bit delayed. So welcome, council, and welcome all those that are viewing us by live streaming or on CHCO and whatever the method is. So I will look first to an approval of the agenda, please.
Your Worship, I have an amendment to make to the agenda. I would like to add an item under new business. And what that item is a consideration of first reading for an amendment to the zoning bylaw for Seasons by the Sea Bistro so that they can obtain a lounge license, so to permit them to serve alcohol without serving food. And currently the Red Herring Kennedy Inn and the former Lobster Bay had that in place. So I think it might be fair for council to consider that, at least discuss it this evening.
Okay, so you're bringing that as an amendment. So council, before we approve the agenda, anyone have an objection to that, or shall we add that to the agenda as a friendly amendment to the agenda?
I'm okay.
I'm okay with it.
I'm okay with it.
Hearing no objections, then we will add that. So I will look for a motion to approve the agenda as amended, please.
I so move.
Okay, Councillor Bishop, thank you, and seconded by Councillor Groove. Thank you, Councillor Groove. We'll now move on to disclosure of conflict of interest on any matter before council this evening.
Through you, Your Worship, you need a motion to actually carry that.
Oh. Okay, all in favor of approving the agenda? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah. Sorry.
Aye.
All in
Aye.
favor? Any opposed? Hearing none. That the agenda is approved. And I've already quickly moved to disclosure of conflict of interest, but we'll go back there again. Is there any conflict of interest on any matter this evening? Hearing none, we'll move on, and we now will move to a presentation to be made by Alexander Gopin, planner, Southwest New Brunswick Service Commission, related to the draft zoning bylaw. And just before he begins his presentation, we will deal with 2 or 3 other items a little bit later in the agenda. And just for those who are listening in, there will be a discussion regarding the draft zoning bylaw after the presentation by council. And then we will move to a motion that deals with the appointment of a St. Andrews member to the Charlotte County Regional Tourism Association. And then there will be a discussion regarding bylaw 20-03, a bylaw of the town of St. Andrews respecting the market wharf fee schedule. And then we will get an update from staff in relation to the downtown St. Andrews parking pilot project. And then finally, we will at the very end of the meeting move to a closed session under the Local Governance Act in relation to an employment matter. So after all of that, thank you, Mr. Gopin. Carry on.
Your Worship, members of council, it's good to be here more in person than I was last week, still not quite in person. I'm going to basically present on the changes that have happened to the zoning bylaw since we last spoke on May 29th. That presentation was really what are the big changes that the zoning bylaw, what are major changes in direction, major new sections, and of course those can be discussed, but I'm not really going to present on them tonight. I really want to focus on the feedback that you folks gave to me to incorporate into this newer draft. And then of course, as always happens, we find a few more things in there that need to be changed as well. So I will start sharing my screen. Actually, Paul, you're gonna have to let me share my screen.
Right now.
Looks good. Okay, this is going to be a short presentation. I know there's other things on the agenda, and I think the most important part of this is really the discussion that will happen after. So some of the feedback was about definitions. There's a lot of them, and some of them are redundant, and I would say unnecessary. So many different types of dwellings. They don't all need to be there. Tourist home is one in particular that doesn't need to be there at all and has led to a lot of confusion and definitions around, I would say, tourist residential options have really been tightened up. Multiple unit dwelling and references to it were removed. It was only used as a definition, and there's already a definition for apartment dwelling, which covers all the same things. So you don't need both of those. Two-family dwelling is now a little bit more distinguished from semi-detached dwelling. At first reading, they seem like more or less the same thing, or a semi-detached is a category of a two-family dwelling. But if you read a little bit closer, the key difference is the two-family dwelling sits on one lot, and the semi-detached dwelling actually goes across lot lines with a common wall right on the property line. So that's just a little bit clearer now in the definitions. Long-term care facility was very similar to residential care facility. There were a few aspects of that, some sort of detailed points that came from long-term care facility that were moved into residential care facility. Council wanted this change to be made, so it's not that we're maybe going to give notice to landowners if there's a variance in the neighborhood. We usually do 100 meters. We shall, now we always have as practice, but having in the zoning bylaw as shall is obviously very strong language and can't get around it. Now this is one thing we picked up. The MR2 zone standard, so that's your high density multiple residential, and the only property that currently uses that one is the Anchor's Landing property. And it's my suspicion that when that zone was created, it was actually created specifically for that development. And if you compare it to other high density multiple residential zones, it's quite restrictive. So the minimum lot frontage is 100 meters. Typically, if you look at other municipalities there, I think 35 to 45 meters. And then the 2.5 meters per dwelling unit, if that's greater, it can be much, 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 much greater. So I don't think that's necessary. And if you think about the future residential growth area, that would have 100-meter frontage, so it wouldn't cause an issue, but I think it's worth council thinking about, does it need to be that restrictive? And then the maximum lot coverage as well. Looking at other municipalities, the standard there is 45 to 50%. And so that just makes it a little bit more flexible what can be done with the land in the MR2 zone, and especially with the the residential growth area. I think you're looking at more of these types of developments, so having a little bit more flexibility could be a good thing. One comment from council was that the mixed-use zone was too permissive. And if you're not super familiar with it, it's basically you pick a stream. You can do your serviced residential, you can do central commercial, you can do, as it is currently, you can do institutional and tourist commercial. But those are slightly more intensive uses. So you could go further and like the lounge, make this subject to an amendment, but a slightly less restrictive option is to make it subject to terms and conditions. So have a tourist commercial or an institutional use be conditional. So it would, if you wanted to do one of those in the mixed use zone, you would have to go to PRAC for them to set terms and conditions, and we would work with the CAO and possibly council to figure out what the best terms and conditions would be. So it still allows them, but it allows us to put parameters on them. Lots of comments about signs. There were concerns about flashing lights. So we've effectively banned them. There was also a concern with all the new signage that we're seeing now around public health measures and physical distancing, all that stuff. That shouldn't really be subject to the same sign bylaws as advertising signs. So basically, any sign that provides information relating to public health and safety would be allowed. And then I think the mural signs, it's a little unclear. And in my opinion, reading the bylaw, murals that were not advertisements would have been allowed as it states now, but that can be cleared up. So this language is really just clearing that up. So if it's a mural that is artistic and is not advertising anything, pointing out anything, then you don't need a permit for it. But if it is basically an advertisement or anything else that is regulated as a sign, then it becomes a sign. And then there are a few points of clarification. I think there were questions about these things, and as I read through the bylaw, I was like, okay, these actually were addressed before, but I did want to point them out, and I did want to get this little joke in. Why did the chicken cross the road? To have the bylaw enforcement officer called on its owner. Because there was a question, what happens if chickens get loose? That's a very reasonable concern. But I think the bylaw as it is, or the draft of it, the chickens have to be kept in an enclosure or fenced area, and they also have to be kept in such a way that they don't cause a nuisance. And if either of those things happen, then that's an issue for bylaw enforcement. And that person probably, I don't know how that would work, but you get a warning, maybe do it better. And if you don't, then you probably lose the ability to have chickens. And then I think there was a question about the definition of a street banner, and it was there. So it's a temporary sign advertising an event or occasion, made of flexible material fixed to lamp standards or telephone poles or hung between telephone poles. And there's no changes to the map right now, but one thing that should probably be done with this is there are, I'm not quite sure how many, but there are a number of legally non-conforming properties. If you remember 235 Water Street, that had to be rezoned because it's in it was zoned as central commercial, although it was basically a cottage. And in order for an extension or even any structural renovations to be done, because that's a residential use and not a commercial use, they had to get it rezoned, which is time consuming for the person, is time consuming for council. And there are several other properties like that. And I've actually gone ahead and identified them. Now, of course, this would have to be done with owner's consent. For some reason, they might want to stay as being central commercial. But the mixed use is still a commercial designation under the future land use map, so there's no changes necessary there. And any change in the mixed use zone, if you're changing from a residential use to a commercial use, that is, again, subject to terms and conditions. So if there are concerns over, well, if you let this happen, then a residential property could decide to become a commercial property. Of course, they are central commercial now, so they could do that, but the mixed use zone does address that. And I think there's probably a few more in town that are like that, and that's kind of some detailed cleanup work that will need to be done when the drafts are a little bit closer to being ready. But I did want to bring that to council's attention.
Xander,
Yes.
for that topic you were just on, when I read, and I think this is the newer version, so you have terms and conditions might be applicable or could be applicable with course commercial institutional, but you still have central commercial just as one of the main uses.
Yeah.
Why is, because why, if we're calling a zone mixed use, why don't we just let it be mixed use? People know when they buy a house in a mixed use zone, there could be a bed and breakfast or another tourist thing or a barber or something, like they're buying into a mixed use zone. Why, I guess, are we putting these extra hurdles in the way of people that live there?
Frankly, it wasn't something that we had put in the draft. It was something that it sounded like after May 29th, and I don't think you're actually at that meeting, Councillor Harrison.
I was playing hooky.
Yeah. It was something that came up then. So with the institutional uses, you can get into some pretty intensive stuff. But realistically, you have tourist commercial properties down there. You are basically in the central commercial zone anyways. So I think it's really kind of up to council what they want to do with it. And there's reasons to go both ways.
Because just off the top of my head, I'd think tourist commercial would be less, as you said, intensive than central commercial overall, where you could have like a full retail store beside you versus a B&B,
You could have a hotel in the tourist commercial,
Yeah.
although the lot sizes would definitely
Boom.
limit what it could
Okay. No, just curious about
The
that.
other thing too is that,
Councillor
The-
Groom,
the-
yes.
yeah, the mixed use zone right now is predominantly residential
be.
with a few, I guess, artists and a few minor hotels or bed and breakfast or whatever. I'm a bit concerned if we open the floodgate for that there could be all kinds of development that we really don't want or could negatively impact on the residents, the residential character of the neighborhood. So I think we have to be very careful how we regulate that. And I share your concerns, Andrew, about the intensity of an institutional use coming in our mixed use zone, which is, as I say, it's surrounded by residential neighborhoods.
But remind me though, those have always been in, like this isn't new to put central commercial or institutional into that description. It's new to we're almost taking it out of the description now. We're putting TNCs on them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they would still be allowed. And the idea with TNCs is you're trying to make it so that it's not going to cause an issue for your neighboring properties.
Right.
Council, anyone else have questions?
Your Worship, I just wanted to thank Alexander for putting all the time into that. I know that last time I had a lengthy feedback, and it looks like he took good notes and implemented a lot of the things I proposed. So I just wanted to acknowledge his efforts in revising the draft.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Groom?
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a number of comments. I'll just go through them to provide Mr. Gopin with some feedback, if I may.
Certainly.
I'll just preface by saying I didn't make it all the way through the document. I just sort of started nodding off partway through. Anyway, starting at the beginning, if I look at section 1, subpara 3, it references the Municipalities Act. Should that be the Local Governance Act?
That should. That's a good catch.
And also in the first section, I know at our last meeting, and I think that Mr. Henderson sort of gave us a nod on that, is that I'd like to see some sort of a statement that says the intent of the bylaw is to set a consistent approach to development in the town of St. Andrews, and that variances should be granted in exceptional circumstances. And something along the lines that the onus is always on the applicant to demonstrate why the bylaw cannot be followed. And that's important because in in the recent past, it's almost been, I'll just go for a variance, and it's a way around our bylaw. And we really need to have the applicant demonstrate why they can't follow the bylaw. Is there a reason? Next item I had is when we get to definitions, this is just a bone I'm stuck with, is do we really need to have the definition of an abattoir? It's not mentioned anywhere in the bylaw. I don't think we'll ever get an abattoir.
I'm looking for a side hustle.
The only reason,
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
the reason to have a definition in there that isn't used anywhere else is to explicitly define it so that it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And there are other definitions in there, I think like adult entertainment use, that are kind of like that. So they clearly define it so you can't say, oh, you know, the restaurant I have, yeah, we're going to be slaughtering animals on site, but we're really a restaurant.
The next item is, when I look at the definition of accessory dwelling unit, there's been 2 items added in there, C and D, which I think may be problematic because it says item C, when contained in a single family dwelling is synonymous with rental unit. And then when contained in an accessory structure is synonymous with a garden suite. And I don't know if we're opening up a Pandora's box with those 2 extras that have been added in.
So those have always been, you could have a rental suite. I believe it was called an in-law suite before. And you could have a garden suite, although having a residential use and accessory building, that has been opened up. Really what this definition is doing is it's trying to simplify it, because before you had accessory dwelling unit was something in the basement. An in-law suite was something not in the basement. A garden suite was something outside. And this is basically saying they're all types of accessory dwelling units.
Yeah, but I'll get to garden suite in a minute, but garden suite, the old bylaw had restrictions on who could stay in a garden suite. It had to be a family member. It had to be a certain category of people. Now that's been removed and opened up.
You can't do that. That's there have been human rights cases around that. It's called people zoning, and if you look at the definition of family, it doesn't actually say a group of people who are related. It's a group of people who are sharing a dwelling unit. And the reason why that's changed, and this is across the world in planning, or at least across North America, is a bunch of places got sued because they were regulating who could live together. And the courts have been very clear that you can regulate density, but you can't regulate relationships between people.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'll just throw it out there, Xander. When you're putting those in, perhaps maybe a notation that it's for long-term accommodations, because I know that in many of these definitions, it's implied that it's long-term accommodation, but it's not explicitly stated. So I think if we state that would help clarify things a lot.
Yeah.
Same thing with converted dwelling. It's a long-term accommodation. It's not short-term. Same thing with dwelling units. Garden suite, again, we've taken out all the issue of who can stay there. So the concern is the garden suite was initially put in there for family members or your mother-in-law or whoever. Now the risk is that you'll have garden suites pop up all over town so that people can have a second dwelling unit on their property that they can lease out. So I don't know how to control that, or if we want to control that.
Well, it is controlled by the number of buildings you can have on a lot. And you can only do it in certain zones. And part of the idea was to create more places that could be leased. And so it would open up rental opportunities.
Yeah. As long as we make a garden suite a long-term accommodation, I have no problems with that. I'm not sure, like I'm not sure what we mean by group home. It's sort of it's a nebulous description. And then you get into the whole thing of habitable room, which, not sure. You took out hedge from the definitions.
I still have it in my version.
Oh, okay, yeah, you do. Okay, I got my mistake. The other one I found was is a substantial change from the current bylaw, and I think we need to address it, is the definition of height. Is currently in the zoning bylaw, the definition of height is from the grade level to the highest point of the building. The new definition is from grade level to the midpoint of the roof on a pitched building, and it differs according to the building type. The problem I see with that is that people around town have been limited in the height of their buildings based on the old definition. I know, like, for example, my building, I was restricted to 29 feet, so I built to 29 feet. Under the new definition, I could probably go up as high as 36 or 37 feet. So we're going to have an uneven playing field, so that somebody who's building a new home is going to be able to go much higher than people have in the past. And I know we've turned down people at PAC who have asked for very small increases in their height. So I'm not sure if we introduce this new definition for height, if we reduce the allowable height to take into account the change in the definition, that's one option. Or we just go back to the existing. I'm not sure how we approach that.
Yeah, so I think I agree with you there. When this was added, I mean, this is the standard for how you define height now. If you look at any other zoning bylaw, I mean, this is how they do it. But it does change the playing field, and it would be very complicated to figure out how do you adjust this so that you can still define height in this new way and keep an even playing field. So I think it probably does make sense just to go back to height is the highest point on your.
I agree.
Could I ask though, like, I mean, possibly we want to change the playing field, because sometimes when you redo a zoning bylaw, you make changes. So, I mean, just in thinking of that, did we just change this new idea because it's the commonly used idea among zoning bylaws, or?
Yeah, pretty much. It was the best practice. There are other ways. I mean, in the historic business district, there are, and I think the town plat too, there are, with the secondary plan, it does allow more flexibility in height, and it's contextual. So it's, percentage of what's on the block, or, you can go 10% above up to a maximum point. And I think the maximum historic business district, what we talked about last week, was 12.5 meters, which is higher than the current 11 meters. So we are introducing some flexibility in that way. And really, this was just, it's a little easier to do height this way when you're measuring it, but the idea of trying to figure out how to make this work with what's already happened, I'd rather not do that.
Mm-hmm.
Your worship, if I may, though,
Certainly.
through you.
Mr. Spear, yes?
So, I think during the committee meeting, though, there was discussions about why we wanted the flexibility with the roof height. I think that maybe Mr. Gopan should go back to his notes. One of them seemed to be that we read into issues a couple of years ago where someone had to do a different style pitch roof in order to raise his R factor for his home. And so that's kind of was on environmental reasons. So instead of giving just saying eliminate it, maybe let him go back to his notes and make an update to council and bring it up to the next version, at least so we can revisit that it wasn't done just because it was the easiest for the planners, or at the time there was a lengthy discussion that it was probably best practice and needed under newer building codes.
Yeah, the problem there, Chris, Mr. Spear, is that that was Mr. Smith. And I recall that decision because he wanted to do a roof with a very steep pitch. And he actually changed his design to accommodate the height restrictions of the town. If I was in his shoes, I'd be a little bit peeved off if all of a sudden now we changed the rules so that anybody can do anything, really. And he wouldn't have had to change his design.
But shouldn't
So-
we be happy if we make the rules better? Like,
No, but if somebody-
aren't we
here's
doing
the
something that
problem.
would have allowed him to have done what he wanted to do?
Yeah, but here's the problem. If you have someone that comes in with a very steep pitch, okay, that means that their building can be very tall.
Mhm.
Okay, and it would literally dwarf all the other buildings around it. Because the other buildings right now, under the old rules, the maximum height is 29 feet. You could come in with someone who wants a steep roof and potentially have a building that's 35 to 40 feet high, depending on the pitch of the roof. So that would pose some problems in terms of having a homogeneous appearance around town, and you know it's going to make things more complicated. So based on that, I tend to agree with Mr. Gopan that we just go back to the old one. It makes it a level playing field for everyone.
I guess, Your Worship, if I may, the question is have we had a compelling case to why we should change it? Because generally speaking, if something's working, you don't have to fix it. I haven't had too many issues over the last 4 years where this has come up before council or any major issues about prac. The other thing I'll say is a lot of people do position their home and their view of the ocean based on the town bylaws. And if you all of a sudden allow homes that are in adjacent properties to build up higher, they strategically might have put a window in a certain place on their lot to have a view that, because we changed the bylaws, might now be obstructed. So there is a little bit of risk with neighbors and things like that to take consideration on views and things like that. So I just haven't had a lot of requests and a lot of things that our building, our zoning bylaw on height has really deterred from building a house in St. Andrews. So I guess my question is why would we change it then?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
Okay,
Council,
the next item I have, Your Worship.
Both the Deputy Mayor and our CAO, that this is going to require a little bit more briefing on the part, because I see this as a hot button issue for a number of reasons. I can see the arguments on both sides. The other thing we have to make sure too, because I remember we did have a case at PAC a few years back where someone built their house from finished grade when our bylaw said you measure the height of your house from the natural grade. So if we're going to stick with natural grade, then we have to make sure that's all communicated properly in our bylaw so that we don't get people filling in a low lot and then building a strongly pitched roof at a height that could be even bigger than what we anticipated. So
I think one problem with that, though, is we also have the, whatever it is, the environmental overlay, where we have lowlands right now on the water that need to be, like, the natural grade needs to be raised by 10 feet. So can they now only make single floor homes? So
that's why I'm saying we need to go back to the drawing board on this. I don't think we're finished with this before we get to the right answer. Yeah, there's lots of issues, and that does tend to come up quite often. Where
Next item I have, Your Worship, is under the definition of land for public purpose. Item number H is an error, and that should be deleted. Just the item. it's a continuation. G carries over, and there shouldn't be an H.
And a highway. Okay, so highway should still be there, but just no H. Okay.
Just the way it's worded,
Yeah.
the numbering system. Rolling along. Okay, again with rental suite, some wording to say it's on a long-term basis.
Your Worship, Councillor Gumishal here, if I may interrupt, just on a point of order.
Councilor Gumishal.
If I appreciate Councillor Gru's concerns. If he has more than 10 minutes of comments, shouldn't we ask him to work directly with the planner and then bring those forward? I mean, how long are we going to go through this again? With like, how long is the meeting going to be? Basically, is the question.
Point
So,
taken, Councilor Gumishal.
Your Worship, if I may, my only concern with that is I really can't take direction from a single councillor. I have to take direction from council as a whole. And
That raises an issue too, because we haven't voted on anything.
Yeah.
Like this whole idea of rental suites versus long-term versus short-term rentals. I have less of a problem with people using their rental suites for short-term rentals. So I think we got to actually have a vote on some of these things if Alex is going to go change them.
Council, views on that?
Yeah, Your Worship, just
At that stage. Deputy Mayor?
Sorry to interrupt. If there's anything changed, we should do a quick consensus check, a temperature check, to just make sure that's the general will of council. I think to Councillor Gubishal's point, I think that we did do, I guess, a deep dive on the zoning bylaw, but I think that might have been the meeting that unfortunately Councillor Grube missed. So I think he's trying to get his input in. I might be mistaken, but I think that's what happened. Is that correct, Councillor Grube?
I believe so, but I thought that we were going to go through the zoning bylaw in some detail. And I thought this was council's chance to go through it. And I know that I've sat at a number of council meetings where other councilors have gone on at length for a lot more than 10 minutes on any one item without interruption. So I think this is a very important issue that we all need to look at, and it's probably one of the more important bylaws that we have.
I'll address that as a point of order. I think that we can't go on for half an hour, but carry on, Councillor Grube. I agree with you. That's what this purpose of this meeting is, and hopefully it won't be too long. And as to whether we need to take a consensus vote about whether we agree with this will come to vote at some future time. We're still in the very preliminaries of dealing with the bylaw. So nothing's going to be etched in stone, and we will all get to vote. Well, I might not, but you guys will all get to vote on what's going to go in the bylaw eventually.
But I think what we need to know is when we get a new version next week, is it going to be the new version plus all of Councillor Gru's changes? Or is it going to be just a notation that Councillor Gru brought up some ideas to change? Like, because I mean, it's a lot, as Councillor Gru said, it's a long document. It's hard to get through it all. There's a lot of balls in the air in that document. I think we got to make some decisions and know what we're doing, and so we can leave parts of it, put it to bed, and move on.
Okay.
Your Worship, if I may,
Yes.
just maybe the recommendation would be that as any councillor has suggestions, as Councillor Gru's doing, staff will make notes, and then instead of amending the document, we'll just make a table or a page that says this is the requests or the issues that have been brought up by council, and take it one by one later. As Councillor Gru said, this was a meeting to go through the document and try to have council give their bring up their questions and interpretation, so we can try to move it together. But maybe instead of putting together a next version of the document, we'll just put all the points forward that are considered, and council can go through those one at a time and debate them at a future meeting.
Sounds good.
Yep.
The
Council.
next item. Sorry. Next item I have for Mr. Zander, Mr. Gopin, is you've deleted tourist home, but it's still referenced in the document. You still mention tourist home in the zoning bylaw. So that needs to be reviewed at some point. Um, I'm running out of comments if that's of any assurance to anybody. Under para 3.22, and that deals with fences. Just a question is that when you look at para 2, it sort of indicates that a fence can be a fence in a front yard or flankage yard can be 6.6 feet in height. But in the town plat and historical business district, it's 3 feet. For the sake of consistency, should we not just make it 3 feet right across town?
I mean, I guess it'd be the difference between like a suburban type fence, like a pool, because if you have a pool, you gotta have probably the 6 feet.
No, I'm talking front yard and flankage yard. It seems kind of odd that we would have a 6-foot fence in the front yard outside of the town plat, but in the town plat, it's 3 feet. So it's 3.22 para 2. So if you could have a look at that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing, just as a clarification, is when you look at fences and you look at para 3.22, paras 3 and 4, I would suggest that they talk about the 3-foot limitation, but I would suggest that in both of those paragraphs, it should be front yard or flankage yard, because a flankage yard is essentially right on a street as well.
Right.
So you probably want to have that limitation on both sides of that that property. On to the famous chicken clause. I would suggest that and either we delete the chickens or we put in a provision that the chickens, put in a clause that says outside of the town plat and environs. The conditions you've put there with the 33 feet is probably going to eliminate most properties in the town plat anyway.
Your worship, if I may, I think the last time we reviewed this, the general will of council was to leave it in and then go to the hearing of objections and then make a decision based on that. I understand Councilor Grew has some concerns about the chickens. I think he's probably not alone, but I think that because we did talk about that last time, we decided that we were going to leave it into the hearing of objections and hear what the public had to say, because this document was formed through the feedback through the municipal plan, and we thought it'd be good to hear from the public on that.
I concur. I think it stays in for now, and we can debate that at the appropriate time.
On the chicken 3.25 para 2D, there's a error there. The enclosure and structures mentioned in para C instead of para E.
Mm-hmm.
The other question I had was on 4.1.6, portable and temporary garages. I'm not sure if maybe we should prohibit portable and temporary garages from the town plat. I'll just throw that out there. It's something that might be considered. Para 4.1.10, when we start talking about bed and breakfasts, boarding houses, and group homes. In the group homes, you have 2 paragraphs, B and C, where prior to being occupied, it is inspected by the building inspector and fire marshal. And in reading that, I thought that should be applicable to both boarding homes and bed and breakfasts as well, so that they're inspected by the fire marshal and by the building inspector to make sure they conform before they're occupied. And the same thing about the satisfactory evidence is provided to the development officer that it complies with all provincial regulations, just so everyone's on a level playing field.
Is that not just increasing red tape though on our B&Bs and that? I mean, and will we need to hire more people to do all this? And will we become liable if we don't do it right and someone sues because we didn't pick up on an error?
We're already liable.
Well,
We're
not
liable
if our
to,
policy is that we don't, we're not there to enforce provincial regulations. We're there to enforce our bylaws.
yeah, but the municipality is liable for the building code for ensuring that the national building code is observed.
Yeah, but this is doing more than that. This is sending people
And the
into
fire code.
places that are already made, if I'm reading it right, and then nitpicking, saying, well, have you done this? Have you done that? These are 150-year-old homes that people use as B&Bs.
If I may, I am not a building inspector, but I do work with them. And one thing they've hammered into my head is that a change of use like that does require, if there's more occupancy, if it changes from like a class whatever to a class whatever, there are different standards for building codes, and people might have to renovate if they want to have those uses. And now it's also possible that these are actually, obviously any new building has to be inspected by a building inspector and has to meet all applicable building and fire code regulations. These might be redundant. I'm not totally sure.
Mhm.
They might just be stating something that already is the facts. But I can look into that more.
Okay. Para 4.2.1. In the main uses, you have a statement there. It says a semi-detached dwelling if located outside the town plat and environs. But then, can you have the similar statement for a triplex? It seems odd that a duplex has to be outside the town plat and environs, but a triplex can be anywhere. So if you just reword that slightly and say triplex if located outside town plat and environments and historical business district.
I think the semi-detached, though, Guy, was the thing where you had the property lines in between.
Yeah, that's correct.
So not a duplex specifically, but more like the garden homes down on the point, towards the point.
Mhm.
And a two-family dwelling is allowed anywhere. So I think it really is about the straddling the lot line. That is the concern there.
Well, I'm not sure that we want triplexes in the historical town plat. I think that might be a mistake. The next one, 4.22, is the current bylaw has converted dwellings to a maximum of two dwelling units. We're now increasing it to 3 dwelling units. The challenge there is that a converted dwelling has separate entrance. So now you're asking, or you're permitting 4 separate entrances on a single family home, which can look really awful, especially if it's all stairs.
Well, it would be conditional, so that could be controlled with terms and conditions. And I think, and maybe this will change, but if you're allowed a triplex, then converting a single family home into a triplex, in my opinion, should also be allowed.
And you can always have terms and conditions, so the front door is the front door for all 3, with then 3 apartment doors inside, I assume. Or is that different than a triplex?
Now, a converted dwelling by definition has a separate entrance.
The definition for converted dwelling, it's a building originally built and designed as a single family dwelling that has been altered to contain 2 or more dwelling units. So it doesn't actually deal with entrances.
So you could have a single front door and then 3 apartments inside would be a converted dwelling, I assume.
Yeah, from the definition that, yeah, in a dwelling unit, the definition could be outside or a common hallway or a stairway.
See, when you look at that, that's where the devil's in the details. A dwelling unit can have a private entrance from the outside. And you're allowing 3 separate dwelling units. Plus you have the main entrance for the house. So you would have 4 entrances on a house.
I got 5 on mine. A sliding door, a back door.
Hey, Mr. Groos,
They're not all separate apartments, so
Get
that's
back
the
to
problem.
us. How close are we, Councillor Groos, to the end of
Almost
where
to
you
the
left
end,
off?
Your Worship. In the tourist serviced residential zone, Mr. Gopin, you had an interesting clause that I thought was in the tourist commercial zone that I think would be applicable in the tourist serviced residential zone. And what that was you said in tourist commercial, you said notwithstanding section a lot abutting any residential zone, no short-term rental can be permitted unless the side or rear yard adjoining the residential zone has a depth equal to twice the height of the main building or structure. And I thought that was a really clever way to put some distance between an Airbnb or some other tourist product or accommodation from the residential. It's a good way to have that separation and have a sort of a generic standard. So I was wondering if a similar clause could be put in the tourist serviced residential, so that there is some separation between an Airbnb and the rest of the neighborhood, so that there is not there's less disruption to the neighbors. And I think that's about it for me, Your Worship. Thank you for council's patience. I just wanted to.
Thank you, Councillor Groos.
Your Worship.
Anyone else have a comment, please? Mr. Spear?
Yeah, Your Worship, if you don't mind, there's just a couple of things that Mr. Gopin added. I just want to maybe revisit back to. It had to do with under the sign bylaws, and we discussed it at council, but I think we still have to reconsider the wording. One was about signs providing information relating to public health and services. I could just see, I don't disagree with it in principle, especially as a town that's been up a bunch of COVID. I've just got concerns that people could elaborate on it. So somebody could stick up a sign talking about their new gym opening up. We'll say that's health and wellness, or sneaker sale, well, that's health and wellness. So we might just want to relook at that just to make sure that, or that we have at least an okay by the sign, by the bylaw officer maybe on those, on a no fee sign permit. The other one I just wanted to touch back on was the artistic mural. And I've got no issues with it, but the concern, the way it's written right now, is that it could allow somebody on the front street to pick a building to turn the whole front of it into a mural of some type. And I'm not really sure if that's the intent of council. So I don't know if you want council to still have some type of say about where murals are allowed or not. Just trying to keep them in good taste. And all I can think of, and again, I'm not speaking to how good or bad they are, but the town of Sussex a few years ago decided they want to be the mural capital of Canada and encouraged it all throughout the town. So I'm not sure if the council of the town of St. Andrews wants that and still wants to retain some control before people allow large murals anyway on the front or side of their buildings. Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay.
Do we have any control right now on that?
I think a current bylaw doesn't allow it, right, Alexander?
It's complicated because the way it's defined if it's not an advertisement, at least the way I interpret it, if it's not an advertisement, if it's not drawing attention to something, if it doesn't meet a certain list of conditions, then it's art and not a sign. So that could be interpreted differently, but that would be my interpretation of it. You could have something where it's, anything over a certain size needs a resolution by council or something. You could deal with it that way.
Your worship, if I may, I think both of Mr. Spear's comments are very warranted. I do think that a lot of people could say it's a public health announcement, and that could get skewed very quickly to a healthier type of ice cream. So I think that we need to have some type of restriction in place. And the other thing is, as far as murals, I think there should be some type of checkpoint, because to me, that's something that's very, very in downtown St. Andrews. Even a little mural could have a lot of impact if it wasn't done the right way.
Thank you. I think we need to look at that further. Seems like we need some sort of a screening process, at least, if not a permit process.
Could I ask a quick one? I had my ear talked off the other day about flags, open
Okay.
flag.
Go ahead, Councillor Harris.
What does our bylaw currently do, and what does the new one do when it comes to open flags?
So currently, you're not allowed to have an open flag, but there are lots of properties that were at one point allowed to have an open flag and are basically grandfathered in to having open flags. And it's very hard to say to people, even though everybody else on the block has one, you can't have one. So what we've done with this bylaw is basically said you can do one flag sign, and that includes an open sign. But if you have an open sign, then I don't know what other kind of flag signs you would have, frankly.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So we did not contemplate turn in your flags day instead of grandfathering everybody in? I guess not.
Your worship, Councillor Gummichel here, if I may. I
Yep.
give some thought to the open signs, and growing up here, it used to be the custom that when you were open, you put out a Canada flag or a New Brunswick flag. That's something that the BIA could probably champion, and maybe we could do away with the open signs altogether. So if you have your flag out, you're open, and when you're not open, your flag shouldn't be out. And we could, if we started that, tried to bring that back, I think would eliminate some of the tacky open signs, and would certainly be good for patriotism and be nice.
Maybe even a little St. Andrews flag.
Oh, well, if you have a flag out, you're open, basically.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of people's expectation, but I have seen some open signs left out overnight. And I just think if your flag's out, you're open, and we should try to limit those to provincial and national or flags, right?
Sounds good.
Council, anyone else have a comment for Mr. Gubin? Or all the rest of us, by the way?
And your worship, I guess, as Councillor Grew pointed out, it's a very long document that maybe, as Councillor Gopin, as Mr. Gopin had said, that you can't take direction from any one councillor, but if people, as they are reading this, see more questions, maybe forward them, and we can create a document that lists other concerns that may not have come up here, that still can be brought out to the public, but that allows us to consolidate them into a common document and then discuss them the next time.
Yeah, I agree with that. That would be a useful exercise. One thing I would caution, though, is that although I mentioned earlier on in my comments that we're still at the beginning of the process, we don't want the beginning of the process not to end before next year. So we can't continue to go through this endless going over stuff. So we're going to have to call a halt to it at a certain point in time when we get to the next stage, where that may involve public consultation. I don't know what the next stage will be, but we'll have to get to this decision stage at some point relatively soon, I think. Okay, good. Thank you, Mr. Spear. I think that's a good suggestion. Okay, that's it for the discussion at this point. Everybody's done for the moment. All right, I think we'll move on. Thank you, Mr. Gopin. I appreciate it very much. And the reward for good work, as always, is more work.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll see you guys later.
All right. Okay, we will now move ahead to BTHC 200615, the Charlotte County Regional Tourism Association board member appointment.
All right, sorry, I just had to scroll through to it. All right, so the background, the town of St. Andrews received a letter from the Charlotte County Regional Tourism Association regarding the board nominations. They have requested that the town could nominate a tourism-based individual to represent St. Andrews on the board. The St. Andrews Chamber of Commerce has provided the same letter for nomination. Through discussion and collaborations with the chamber, on the nominee, staff would recommend council support the chamber's nomination of Matthew McKenzie, General Manager of the Algonquin Hotel, to be representative on the CCRTA board. Mr. McKenzie has a strong background in tourism, accommodations, marketing, and operations. We believe he would be a strong representative for St. Andrews on the board. The motion: that council supports the recommendation by the St. Andrews Chamber of Commerce to appoint Matthew McKenzie as the Charlotte County Regional Tourism Association board member for St. Andrews.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Can I have a seconder for that motion, please?
I'll second,
Councillor Grew, thank you.
Your worship, if I could propose an amendment, I would like to amend that it just reads Matthew McKenzie. I'd call it even a friendly amendment. Matthew McKenzie as the Charlotte Coastal Regional Tourism Association, just so we have the correct name.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Deputy. I think that's a friendly amendment.
Friendly amendment.
We're all in agreement.
All right, perfect. So since it's a friendly amendment, if I could, your worship, I just wanted to say that Matthew McKenzie would certainly be a strong representative for the region. He is a former chair of CCRTA. The business that he represents has also been the largest, the customer base has been the largest contribution to the Destination Marketing Fund. And I really think that he could help this organization as they look for their place in the future and how they can make the biggest impact for the region.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Anybody else have comments? Seems fairly straightforward then. I'll call the question if there's no other debate. All in favor of the motion as amended, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, then it's Matthew McKenzie appointed as our representative for the town of St. Andrews. Okay, great. All right. Next, we'll move to FA 200602, and this is a discussion regarding bylaw 20-03, a bylaw of the town of St. Andrews respecting Market Wharf schedule of fees for wharf rates and passenger fees for commercial tour boat operators. Mr. Spear, can I turn to you to give us a bit of background here?
Sorry, Your Worship. So, as you're aware, for lots of reasons, 2020 is going to be a very challenging season for everybody in the town of St. Andrews. But the tour boat operators have been hit especially hard. In a meeting with three of them, they all had been invited to back in May. They didn't even know if they're going to have the ability to run at all that summer. And most of them were saying they weren't even going to bother putting the boat in. And we got a notice from Transport Canada at the end of May that they couldn't even think about it before July the 1st. Well, fast forward a few weeks, and now Transport Canada is saying as long as you're following the rules and regulations of the local authority, which in our case would be the Public Health Officer of New Brunswick, that you're okay to run. So from my understanding and talking to a couple of them, most of them are going to run at a maximum of 50% of capacity. So their number of people they can have have been eliminated tremendously, even on a good day. And of course, the question is going to remain that if 50% of the visitors to the St. Andrews in prior years comes from out of province, we can assume that their capacity to attract people is also going to drop down by 50%. So it's going to be a tremendously challenging year for them. And I think it's also fair to say that with the cost of fuel and insurance and those fixed costs, employee staffing, rent for their facilities, at half a capacity is barely going to cover their cost for the season. So last year we'd started a per passenger fee of $1.50 per passenger based on full capacity. So we just counted the number of trips that a boat makes. We'd say, okay, if they have just as a number, 20 people on the boat, then we're going to charge them $30 for a passenger fee, regardless of how many people actually went on the tour. So if it's a small tour, 4 or 5, they paid on the full crowd. So it increased their cost. Again, it was based on an older system from the that had been implemented where, from my understanding, and the original Wharf Board back in the 90s, that the tour boat operators preferred to base it on the capacity of the boat as opposed to reporting the number of passengers. But back in that day, I think it was only 25 cents per passenger, not $1.50. So that's a substantial change, of course, over the years. Well, in discussions with the tour boat operators moving forward, they're hoping council as a minimum would consider waiving the passenger fee for 2020. Currently, it still sits at $1.50, and they're still trying to make their plans as they are able to operate starting July the 1st. But again, it's with reduced capacity and probably reduced tourists too. So that's really what's up for council's debate tonight. In order to keep this industry moving through such a challenging time, they'd, as a minimum, like us to waive the fees for this year.
May I speak?
Yes, certainly.
I think that may be a very good idea because I think that these tour boat operators are going to have quite a difficult time this season, and if there's something that we could do to help them out a bit, I think it would be really useful. Thank you.
And sorry, Your Worship, just if I may, just for a quick second, I presented a budget to council on May the 11th, and at that point, I just assumed that under the conditions that council would only recover the annual membership fee from the tour boat operators. So I'd made no allowance for this per passenger fee at the time, because under the best information there, we didn't even know if they're going to be operating. So that has already been removed from the budget for 2020.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. That would have been my question as well. Where do we sit with our newly approved revised budget for 2020? And so if council chose to do this, it would not impact our budget that we just approved a couple or 3 weeks ago for the remainder of the year. Okay, good. Council,
Your Worship, just to be clear, so staff's recommendation would be to charge the wharf fees and to waive the passenger fees. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's what staff are recommending.
At this point in time, yes, just despite the extra costs for the challenges of the tour boat operators and the pleasure boaters, the town of St. Andrews also has incurred extra costs for this year. So we do have to try to recover at least some type of revenue. It's going to be down substantially from prior years, but I think for them to show their appreciation for the efforts we're putting in to make it safe for all their passengers, that we at least maintain the annual membership fee that their boats pay.
Your Worship, I just think that that's fairly fair based on numbers passed. That would be, we're charging them about 15% of what they would on a good tourist year. So I think that is quite a reduction. So just if you're looking for feedback on this particular one, I would support that motion for this for 1 year period.
Councillor Grew, you had a question?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to make it formal, I'd like to move that we waive the passenger fee for the year 2020 on the tour boats.
I'll second the motion.
Okay. Any further discussion on that motion?
No, I think it's a great idea.
Okay, great. I'm going to call the question then. All in favor of the motion as put by Councillor Grew and seconded by Councillor Bishop, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, we will waive that fee for 2020. And this is similar to other concessions that we've made for other business or, for other people that have been paying us rent and using our facilities. So we will need to get back at this. I know there are some ongoing issues relating to next year already, and I think, or past years. And I think this will become a very significant part of our budget discussion when we get to the fall in terms of what we do next year for the wharf and the fees on the wharf. But for now, that passes, and we will waive that fee and hope that that will help to kickstart whatever business the operators can muster up for the summer. Thanks, folks. That was great. Mr. Spear, I think you.
Yep, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to do this, and I appreciate everything council has done. We have to maybe change the motion because it's built into a bylaw. The motion should have read that the council agrees to amend Schedule A of bylaw 20-03, a bylaw respecting Market Wharf. If council is okay with that amendment to word that motion so it fits appropriately, staff will take that as a yes and make that adjustment to the minutes.
Council, that seems like a very friendly amendment that Mr. Spear can take care of for us. So what do you think? Okay?
Thank you. That would be great.
That's
Thank you.
the spirit of it, yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. And the reward for good work is more work. So you're up next to tell us about the downtown St. Andrews parking pilot project.
Your worship, if I may, if you want to talk about the potential for a bus project, I'll declare a conflict of interest on that.
Okay.
So if we could save that to the end maybe, or
Yep.
that'd be appreciated.
Or not at all. So you look so good in that tie. We don't want you to
Hey,
have
you
to
look handsome,
leave the room.
Deputy Mayor.
It's for Councillor Akaji.
You're so kind.
Hey, Mr. Spear, sorry.
Sorry, the deputy mayor had me flummoxed here. I guess I'd like I won't get too much into details, but I will want to mention it because I think it ties in. Is that all right, Deputy Mayor, that I just mention it in general terms without declaring a conflict?
If you feel that I'm not, then yes. I don't know what you're going to say, but
No,
sure.
it's in very general terms. I won't get
Okay.
into details, but if that's okay to announce it as far as you're concerned. Since you
Oh
brought it
yeah,
up.
absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll do a more formal announcement later, but by all means, go ahead.
Yeah, so we'll say that through a partnership with Kingsbury Gardens, who Brad Henderson, of course, is a worker, besides being our deputy mayor or manager director, have agreed to partner with the town, at least initially, to establish a hop-on, hop-off style bus with no charge to run on a route throughout the town, which is yet to be determined, but it'll likely go through the outskirts of the town, including to potentially the Huntsman, but the details of that are to be worked out a little bit. But I think that's good to start to get that out, and more details will follow. So as far as the town goes, we've made arrangements with 3 property owners to date about additional parking, and Public Works is starting to work on that. And so right now, the pilot project seems to be ready to go ahead. There really isn't much more to update. We've had discussions with the businesses in town, which I had reported last week, concerning parking in front of Joey's Independent, in front of the hardware store, in front of the pharmacy, and near the bank. And they're all on board with it, that we'll probably have more sites for limited parking, 30-minute parking, to try to create some turnover on those short-term sites. And so we'll have a special meeting before the committee meeting next week to bring some of those amendments forward. Right now, everything looks like it's going to be here on time. Our biggest worry was signs, because everyone's producing signs by the truckload, or municipalities are needing them for various changes. But in discussions yet last week with our producers, they should be here. So what's likely going to happen is that on bright and early in the morning of the 26th, Public Works will probably be running at 4:30, 5 o'clock to get all the barricades up and get the downtown ready. So on that Friday morning, the project will be full steam ahead.
Good.
So any
Council
questions, I
comments?
guess, Your Worship, from council on anything?
I have a question. Is the
Councillor
bus
Akaji?
going to run like we had suggested a few days? Is that going to be the details that are going to come out later? I don't want to discuss too many because the deputy mayor is still here, but
Chances
what
are
you're
it'll be a
saying?
limited. There's an assumption by staff and by some of the marketers that probably the busiest days of the week will be Thursday through Sunday. And so many of our plans are going to be dealing with that way, that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday will probably be manageable unless we're surprised, which would be a good surprise for those in the tourist industry. But right now, even sitting in my office, as you know, I can see Water Street. Today was relatively quiet. Tomorrow will be a bit busier. Wednesday about the same, but then it starts to pick up towards the end of the week.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any comment?
Is there a way, CAO, Chris, that we can work with the farmers market to get out the word about the bus?
We'll certainly notify them, and we might push for some parking at the arena and stuff too. Even we could make it easier for them to park from the downtown and get a quick ride down after they've set up. That might be worthwhile to them too. So we'll have to look at that.
Good. Well, it looks like, sorry.
Sorry, the date again that you're going to start putting the barriers up that to block off the streets. What was the date again?
It's Friday the 26th, the start date of the thing, and we're just going to bring staff in good and early to get it going, so we're not taking away parking the Thursday before.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Council, if there aren't any other comments on that, thank you, Mr. Spear, for bringing us up to date on that. That's encouraging news so far, and I know there's a lot more to be done. And I did notice in driving by this today that we've already done some renovations to the site of the Canadian Legion and created already parking spaces there in one day. So kudos to our public works staff who got that all done today. All right. Good. We'll move on, and Mr. Nopper, I think we'll move to question period now.
Through you, Your Worship, I believe you have new business.
Oh,
New business.
pardon me. Yes, we did agree to new business.
So
Councillor
I guess
Groot.
I'll lead off with this, Your Worship, if I may.
Certainly.
I've been contacted by the owner of one of the businesses downtown, the Seasons by the Sea Bistro. And they have sent a letter to the town requesting a bylaw amendment to the zoning bylaw so that it will enable them to serve alcohol without having to serve food. We have a strange clause in our bylaw that says that you have to serve food in order to serve alcohol. And the only way to get around that is for council to amend the zoning bylaw. And that's written into the zoning bylaw. So they can't do a variance, they can't do anything but do an amendment to the zoning bylaw. So the history on this is the Red Herring, the Kennedy Inn, and Lobster Bay, all those organizations were able to serve alcohol without serving food. And it seems to be a quirk of the regulatory body in Fredericton, where they didn't apply the bylaw as equally as they could. So the request right now from this business is they would like to have an amendment to the zoning bylaw to enable them to serve alcohol. I don't know, Mr. Nopper, if Dan Murphy is online.
No.
No? So
No, Mr. Murphy is not online.
That's the gist of the request. So I just wanted to put that in front of council to find out how council wanted to go about dealing with this issue.
Your Worship, if I may, just briefly.
Yes, Mr. Spear.
We have been in discussions with Mr. Murphy for a while, and I guess the normal proceedings would be he should apply to the for rezoning application or an amendment to the rezoning through the RSC, who would provide a report. These are what the other businesses have done in town. We were going through the various motions of the PAC that primarily seem to deal with it in the past. And so I would recommend that in order to follow procedure that he should go through that way. What we could do is if he gets that application in the next few days, we could bring it forward to council by the committee meeting next week and still bring it forward for first reading at the July 7th or 6th, I guess, July 6th meeting. But that he should follow the normal course of process. He can make a written request because there is a $1,000 fee to do this, but it's probably best interest of the council to accept that fee. In essence, so it's not a fishing expedition, I guess. Long story short is why those fees are typically put in, that you won't have a lot of people throwing in these requests without really needing it. So we've done a lot of research at council and can provide more input, but I would like to see Mr. Murphy apply through the normal course for this, and then we'll expedite it as quick as we can and as quick as council will allow us in the summer to try to get this passed.
So what you're suggesting is that for next week's committee meeting, we can have that background information to discuss at the committee meeting, and we will, and you're asking that we tell you to go back to Mr. Murphy and tell him to make a formal application so that we can consider that next week.
That would be my recommendation, Your Worship, as well as all of staff's recommendation at this point.
Councillor Grew, you had a comment?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I have spoken to Mr. Murphy at length on this, and I've spoken to Mr. Henderson, and it's an oddity in our zoning bylaw. We do not require, Mr. Murphy does not require rezoning of any kind. He's properly zoned for the business that he's in. What he requires is a zoning bylaw amendment. And that's what's specified in our zoning bylaws. The only way to change this is through a zoning bylaw amendment. And in talking with Mr. Henderson, his take on this is it's not the Southwest Regional Service Commission's business to propose a zoning bylaw amendment. It's for Mr. Murphy to approach the town and have council do a zoning bylaw amendment. And Mr. Murphy has already written a letter to the town, I think it was the 3rd of June, to get this started. And he's sort of being, bounced back and forth, and he just wants to get some sort of resolution to this as quickly as possible so he can get on with his business.
Your Worship, if I may. So I'm not saying for or against it. I'm just thinking that the clause on food was to stop like bar-like atmospheres happening all over the town. By putting the food in, it made it where restaurants were encouraged, and to encourage people to have a meal while they had a drink. It's a completely different atmosphere. So my fear is just to do a blanket rezoning is all those restaurants downtown could happily stop serving food and then just become bars and pubs essentially, if it wasn't a requirement. Maybe I got that wrong. And then my other concern about this is, again, I could be wrong on this, is if we start amending the zoning bylaw for this, and then we want to proceed with our own zoning bylaw, are we going to go to first reading twice, second reading, like one will be in first, one will be in second reading? Is it possible to do both those exercises at the same time? I'm just wondering how that would work.
Good point, Deputy Mayor. I'm not precisely sure either how that would work, but I take it from what Mr. Spear told us before that in fact we are going to deal with this, or we can deal with this ourselves. It really doesn't involve the planning, the PRAC or the Planning Commission. We can deal with this, but the question becomes, how do we get around dealing with this every time somebody wants this to be done? And how do we get around the fact that a bunch of other places got grandfathered in previous times or got dealt with in a different way? It just seems totally odd to me that we would have to be going through this. But Mr. Spear, what do you is that essentially what? I don't think we're in any great difference here in council. I think we would like to see this proceed probably, or at least proceed in some sort of a timely fashion, although we just got the letter on June the 3rd for the summer. It's an unusual summer, so I guess we can't blame people for not planning ahead, but it is a cumbersome process for what may be a fairly simple decision in the final analysis. Mr. Spear, am I out to lunch on that, or is that close?
Well, I think you got to be careful, Your Worship, and because a lounge license can mean a lot of things, and so we got to be careful because they can extend the hours. They can, so Mr. Murphy might have great intentions now, but in discussions with public safety that monitors these things, he could sell his business with a lounge license under certain conditions, and then you could have almost any type of thing going. So as we remember, the downtown area where the business is located is also a residential area. So I think you want to make this as public as you can. I'll certainly relook at it and see if a bylaw amendment is different than a rezoning, but I do know it had gone to councils in the past for those two particular places, the Kennedy and the Red Herring, that there are minutes that support that. So we want to keep this as public as we can, but we'll see how we can expedite it, and whether it's a rezoning or not, I guess we can revisit that. It's whether it's $1,000 fee or just amendment by council, we can revisit too, but we'll work closely with the proponent to try to get this before you.
So I take it from that, if council's in agreement, that we will have something a little more expansive and a little more precise for next week's committee meeting, and we'll delve into it then. Mr. Spear, is that fair assignment?
Well, thank you, Your Worship. And staff the clerk did a lot of research on this today and has a lengthy report available for council to see, but we just wanted to bring it before you first tonight, and we'll polish it up before the meeting package on Wednesday.
Okay, good. Thank you, Mr. Spear. Thank you, Mr. Knopper, for the research that we will see soon.
Councillor Grew, Your Worship.
One thing I'd like to point out is I think staff's caution on this is well founded, because I would expect that the Nano Brewery might have a similar request around the corner if we grant this one for the Seasons by the Sea Bistro. So there are other implications, and it could be far-reaching.
That's a good point, Councillor Grew. They very well could be putting a food option in just to be compliant with the bylaw, and if we change it for once, they might have been, why did we install all that stuff for maybe a kitchen type setup when they could have just done the same thing? It's a very valid point.
Your Worship, I don't mind chiming in and saying that I think council, I've said before that we shouldn't be restricting businesses if they want to serve liquor or they want to have a lounge license or whatever. I think especially this year, given that it's COVID, we should be waiving the fee for Mr. Murphy, and I think if the market will determine what sells downtown, whether restaurants are successful or pubs. And I live down here, and I think we need more places to go. And when I go for a beer in the winter and I'm sitting there by myself, it'd be great to have other people there to join me.
Thank you, Councillor Grimshaw. We'll get at this next Monday night in earnest. Thanks. Okay, Mr. Knopper, now I think we can go to questions.
Yep. I'll open up the floor up to Lisa Eldridge. Lisa, do you have any questions or comments for council? You guys have the floor. Just give them a minute. As I see no questions or comments, I'm going to just what we have on social media. There is one question, and I think I can handle it from our end, the staff's point. The question is, it's not on a topic discussed, but it's where are there things that deal with nuisance deer programs in St. Andrews? That was from Robbie Cumberland. I will respond directly to him with information on that, Council. Okay. Other than that, that's all the questions or comments we have.
Okay, great. I'll go to councillors and deputy mayor for comments, or everybody okay for now? And I don't have anything in particular myself, so
just a quick one, Your Worship, if I may. I know it's not a regular council meeting, but it is graduation week for Sir James Dunn Academy, so I thought it'd be nice to give all the graduates a shout out from town council. It's a very important week to them all, and we're very proud of their accomplishments. So I didn't want to close the meeting without saying that. And then the other thing I just wanted to recognize is the council's decision to waive the passenger fees at the wharf. I'm very impressed at how much this council has changed the way that we do business and the way that we charge fees, and it's been very bold in order to help businesses get through this time. And I'm just very appreciative of council's overall direction and doing anything possible to help businesses get through this time.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. And since you're a proud graduate of the facility we're just talking about, the educational institution, you should lead us with a in the cheer, if you wish.
I think I'll stay on mute, Your Worship, but I do have their mug.
Okay, good. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Henderson. Okay, look, I will look
Your Worship,
now to
Your Worship, can I just follow up with the Deputy Mayor's comments? Just
certainly.
to remind everybody that might be watching as council that there's actually like a drive-by receiving line that council had approved a couple of weeks ago. That'll be on the 18th, which is Thursday at 3 o'clock, I believe. Is that right, Paul? 245-3. Yeah, where people should come down Prince of Wales Street, then turn in by the Indian Point Park, and the graduates will be there. It's meant to only roll down your window, wish them congratulations, wave to them, and keep moving. But certainly we'll mention it on Facebook and send an email to council later in the week to remind you that if you're available to maybe show our appreciation for our graduates and hopefully our future counselors someday.
Right, exactly. We have to start somewhere, don't we? Great. Thank you, Mr. Spear. Okay, we will move to closed session and motion 06/20. And I'd like to have a motion to move into closed session.
So moved.
I'll second that.
Okay, and just for the benefit of, no, we don't need to be in the benefit because Mr. Knopper, can we, we're now in closed session. Can you ease us out of?
Yep, give me 1 second, council. I'll shut everything down here.
And seconded by Councillor Grew. And now we're all in favor of coming out of closed session?
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Hearing none. We're out of closed session and now we'll look for a motion to adjourn from the.
So moved.
Okay,
Keep
thanks,
up the
Council.
good stuff.
Take care, guys.
See you.
Thanks, everyone.
Did,
Talk to you soon.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
did we make it, Mr. Knopper?
We made it just in time.
Thanks, Paul, for everything. Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.